Hello, everyone. Hello. Welcome to Daf Yomi Week in Review. It is lovely to see you all. We are filing in at the door. My name is Rachel Scheinerman. I edit the website My Jewish Learning and the series A Daily Dose of Talmud. And it's lovely always to see so many familiar faces in this half-hour lightning review of what we did in Talmud this week, and also new faces. I feel like I often see some new faces. So if you are one of the new ones, a special welcome to you. As the old timers here will know, we have a rotating cast of wonderful teachers who will spend half an hour steering us through some of the highlights of what we learned in the Talmud this week. We are somewhere deep in Bava Batra right now, and this week we are joined by Dr. Sarah Ronis. Dr. Ronis, I think we are all assembled, so go ahead and get us started.
Fantastic. Good morning, everyone. Welcome. If you haven't already introduced yourself in the chat, please go ahead and do so. Um, and I might also say, if you are new and you feel comfortable telling us in the chat that you're new, this is a really wonderful, warm community, and I know people would love to welcome you personally. So, what a week we've had in Daf Yomi. Um, we started out, as I'd like to think we should start out every week, with the Talmud talking about the importance of Divrei Torah, matters of Torah. That was a very brief introduction, and then we jumped right back into a really extended discussion about what is included when you sell things or consecrate them to the temple, right? So what is included when you sell a cistern, a dovecote, a beehive, trees, fields, and more. Um, then right, because we were talking about that, and that went on for quite a while. Then we talked about how many trees you have to buy in order to acquire the ground that they grow on, right? If I buy one tree, did I buy any ground? How about two? How about three? And then how much ground do you have to own in order to bring first fruits to the temple in Jerusalem and make the public ritual declaration that you brought the first fruits because God gave you the land, which kind of assumes that you own some land. Because we were talking about, parts and the whole and how much of something it really is all of it, we then shifted to talk about what parts of an animal carcass are sold together. And then we shifted, right? Again, we're talking about sales, so we're shifting. And we talked about under what circumstances can someone renege on a deal, right? When can someone renege on a deal? And when can it be the seller and when can it be the buyer? We had a really fun aside about what makes the sun appear reddish at dawn and dusk. And I know we have some scientists who join us. And so I hope you've learned something about what actually causes the sun to look red. None of that, air particles things. And then we shifted again to talk about what is the actual moment within a sale when the item changes ownership. So really spending a lot of time this week thinking about the details of owning and buying and selling and trees. We spent a lot of time talking about trees, the details of trees and farming, how trees do or don't grow on land, in water, and more. And on the one hand, I thought that this was super detailed and kind of a little tricky to follow, especially because, full disclosure, my PhD is in Talmud. I'm not an arborist. So I don't actually have a degree in forestry. So for me, this was a little bit more difficult to track maybe than for some of you. But on the other hand, I thought even for those of us who are scholars and students of Talmud and not trees, this offers us some really important insight, specifically the discussions of trees into, I would say, how the rabbis think about the universe. So I'm going to share my screen, but I know that some folks like to have it up for yourself. So I've just shared the link. And now let me share a screen. Dr. Scheinerman, would you allow me to share my screen? I promise it'll just be the source sheet.
I'm sorry that should have been done earlier.
We were too busy chatting.
Now you should have that power.
Amazing. Okay. Here we go. All right. So What I want to look at with you in our time together is this discussion about trees in Baba Batra 80B, both from the perspective of forestry and from the bigger perspective of anthropology, and how the rabbis are thinking about what it means to be a human in the universe. So let's start. The sages taught one who buys a tree from another for felling, right? So you're buying the tree, but really what you've said is, I'm buying the wood of the tree, right? I'm buying the tree for wood, must cut the tree 1 hand's breadth above the ground. So a hand's breadth is literally the breadth of your hand, right? So you cannot cut it down to the ground. You have to leave a hand's breadth in a generic tree. In the case of an untrimmed sycamore, 3 hands breadths. A large sycamore, 2 hands breadth. In the case of reeds or of vines, so not quite trees, but still things that grow from the earth, from the knot and above. I actually went into my garden yesterday to look at some of the vines that grow, and I can, in fact, confirm that there's usually some kind of, knot or place that looks slightly different as it continues to grow. In the case of palm and cedar trees, he may dig down and uproot them because their trunks do not replenish themselves. Is everybody seeing the text? Who wants to see the text in some way? Yes? Okay, great. So we don't get a rationale for the sages until we get to the case of palm and cedar, but we can actually work back. So for all of these other trees that the sages mention, you can't cut it all the way to the ground. You have to leave a certain amount of the tree or the vine sticking out of the ground. Why? Because that from there they can replenish themselves. If you've bought the wood of the tree, right? If you've bought the tree for felling, you don't just get to kill the tree. You have to leave enough that the tree will regrow, right? So I'm thinking here about clear cutting as not being appropriate, but instead, if you are right, if you haven't bought the tree, you've bought the wood, you don't get to decide that the tree doesn't grow again, essentially. However, in the case of palm trees and cedar trees, apparently, the rabbis believe that you can uproot them because once you've cut the trunks at all, they won't regrow. And since they don't have the capacity to regrow, you don't have to save any to allow for further growth. So let's stop there for a minute. And I'm curious, what strikes you about this part of the passage? And you can put it in the chat, or if we are technologically able to see your hand up, we should be able to find some folks and unmute them. What strikes you about this rabbinic tradition?
Philip says this is ecologically sound.
Yes, I think absolutely. Absolutely.
Yes, but Lynn says if they're so concerned about allowing trees to regrow, then why do they allow people to cut down ones that don't regrow?
Well, and there I think actually Susan's statement answers Lynn's question, right? What a wonderful dialogue in the chat, right? Susan, who writes, they want to preserve the trees as much as possible. But it may not always be possible. And particularly woods like cedar, which are very strong and very tall and can be used for particular things that other woods can't be used for, they may have a need for cedar wood specifically, but they want to preserve the trees as much as possible. So for trees that have the capacity to regrow, then you have this issue. Now, Aaron asks, what if I don't know whether I'm buying the tree for wood or produce? Well, presumably that would actually be in the terms of sale. Because if you're buying the tree for wood, then the seller would assume, okay, this person's going to come into my field once, maybe even once a year, chop down the wood, and then they're going to leave. So once a year, I'm going to expect 2 hours, 2 hours of some guy with a chainsaw in my field. But if you're buying it for fruit, well, then during the harvest season, that person might be there every day for an hour. And uh, and that's a much bigger imposition. So it would be written into the sale of the tree what you would be using it for. Now, Robert asks, what's the evidence that two is better than one? Is one hand's breadth sufficient? So they're not saying 1, 2, or 3 is better. They're saying they're species specific, that different kinds of trees need different kinds of lengths to regrow. So, so I think, um, so I think we have to understand that even for those of us like me who aren't arborists, this actually does expect us to know something about the different kinds of trees that are in our communities. So let's keep going, and look at the next piece of this discussion. And is it correct with regard to a cedar that its trunk does not replenish itself? Okay, so you said a cedar you can clear cut, but because it doesn't regrow, but is it true that it won't regrow? Didn't Rabbi Chia bar Luliani teach, what is the meaning of that which is written? The righteous shall flourish like the palm tree, he shall grow like a cedar in Lebanon. Okay, so before we get into the rest of it, I just want to note here, those of you who are saying, how much did the rabbis know about trees? It's a good question. I think they probably knew more than we do, just because they were a little bit closer to, they didn't have plastics, right? So they were using wood for a lot more things. But whether or not they are experts at trees, the one thing that at least Rabbi Chia bar Luliani is an expert at is Torah. So their evidence for how trees grow, Rabbi Chia bar Luliani's evidence comes from the book of Psalms. The righteous shall flourish like a palm tree, he shall grow like a cedar in Lebanon. Rabbi Chia bar Luliani is then going to ask, okay, in that verse, if palm tree is stated, why is cedar stated? And if cedar is stated, why is palm tree stated, right? Why are we saying that the righteous is like these two different trees? And to some extent, biblical poetry works in doublets. So biblical poetry usually says the same thing twice in a sentence in two different ways. But for the rabbis, each way that they're choosing to say it is going to have innate and important meaning. Now, had the verse stated cedar and had not stated palm tree, if it only said cedar, I would have said, just as a cedar does not produce fruit, so too a righteous person does not produce fruit. Therefore, it is stated palm tree. And had the verse stated only palm tree and had not stated cedar, I would have said that just as a palm tree, its trunk does not replenish itself after being cut down, so to a righteous person, his trunk does not replenish. Therefore, it is stated cedar. Now, ultimately, they're going to use this discussion to prove that a cedar's palm tree actually does regrow. And so you cannot uproot the cedar tree. But in that discussion, I think they are going to offer us some really important insight. So let's make sure we all understand what that verse is saying. The word palm tree in the verse is there to insist, for Rabbi Chia bar Luliani, is there to insist that the righteous person, produces fruit. Right, that they're not just, strong and mighty like a cedar, they also produce fruit like a palm tree. And here, I think we could think about that fruit in a number of different ways. We could think about that fruit in terms of offspring. We could think about that fruit in terms of righteous deeds. We could think about that in terms of Torah insights. The Talmud does not specify what kind of fruit is described here. I feel confident that it's not coconuts and other things that grow on palm trees, but some kind of metaphorical fruit that righteous people grow. And in the second part, the the Talmud uses the word cedar to show that the righteous person is profoundly resilient. That right, a palm tree, when you cut down its trunk, um, the roots do not the roots die. Right, when you cut down a palm, the roots die. Palm trees are not terribly resilient, according to the Talmud, but cedar trees are. And so when something bad happens to a cedar tree, it can recover and regrow. And so too, the Talmud states here, right, or Rabbi Chia bar Luliani at least states here that the righteous person, when bad things happen to them, has the resilience to regrow, right, to continue to thrive, and to regrow when, you know, bad things hit the fan. So, um, so this text really are sort of struck me in a number of ways. It struck me in a number of ways that are sort of generic, and it struck me in a number of ways relative to where we are right now in the Jewish calendar. So it struck me that the proof for how trees do or don't grow comes from the Torah. And not just from the Torah, but from a discussion in Psalms about people. Right? Because the verse in Psalms is not actually about trees, it's about righteous people. And so what they're saying is we learn about trees from righteous people, but then we also learn about righteous people from trees. Because actually, as the verse in Psalms says, the two are not as different as we think. The two are not as different as we think. And that is a fascinating thing. There is a sort of and I don't mean this in an inflammatory way, but I think very often humans have a sense of species supremacy. We have a sense that we are different and better. And to be fair, we are the beings who, Bereshit, Genesis describes as being created in the image of God. And so it might well be a well-founded sense of species supremacy from the Torah. But I also think that this text reminds us that that we are not as distant from the natural world as perhaps sometimes we like to think. And I think that is particularly striking now as we prepare for Rosh Hashanah. Rosh Hashanah, which is, our marker of the creation of the world. And I literally was just teaching my students the story. We were just doing Genesis in one of my intro classes. And, we noted that the creation of the world in Genesis 1 is one which is highly organized. Everything happens on its day. It's highly segmented, right? So the day that the trees are created is not the day that the humans are created. And yet, there is this sense of everything is part of a divine plan. Everything is part of that universal order. And that when, right at the end of every day, God says, and this was good, right? That the creation on every day is profoundly good in some really important ways. And I think this particular sugya of the Talmud, this particular discussion in the Talmud, is a really beautiful reminder that with all of that order and with all of this being part of the universal plan, we're not as separate as you might have thought, and that in fact we can learn profound things from the natural world around us, and we can learn things about the natural world by understanding better ourselves. And I thought that was a lovely a lovely thought as we were spending so much time talking about trees, the rabbis reminding us that trees aren't actually as different from us as we might think. Um, so that is really what I had wanted to talk about today. That took less time than I thought. So that is fascinating. And
Sounds
and
like we might have a little time for discussion then, if folks
yeah,
would like to do that. I just wanted to, sometimes I fall down Google rabbit holes. I can't be the only one. So when we were earlier talking about, I just wanted to share this. I haven't vetted this site, but I did skim it while we were learning together. Where my mind went with regenerating trees was like, how does Christmas tree farming work, right? Like we have this whole culture in America and many other parts of the world where people are cutting down trees just for what's above the roots. What happens to those stumps? And it turns out that there is like a whole move to regenerate Christmas trees from the stumps. So that isn't necessarily how it's done, but it can be done that way. And a whole interesting discussion of it here in this article. So I realize it's a little off topic, but this is the rabbit hole I went down for a few minutes during this talk. And I wanted to share that with folks. And now let's hear from you guys, though. Carol,
yeah.
you have your hand up. So go ahead.
Um, Thank you so much, Dr. Ronas, for this teaching. It really does open up
Carol?
your connection with the calendar. What during my study, which is very limited, I'm so new at this, I often wonder about the rabbi's sense of displacement or uprootedness in terms of the diaspora and what happened. I know centuries before, but how much of that sense of uprootedness and living in a different place in the diaspora and trying to find the roots back to Torah and to religion and the values of Judaism. Do you see any of that in this metaphor? Thank
So
you.
I think that's a wonderful question, Carol, and I really appreciate that you are connecting this sugya, right? I went out to the universe and you went out to sort of the rabbinic experience. And I think, the more different ways we go out, the richer our understanding of this. I will say the idea that the rabbis feel profoundly displaced and uprooted is not quite accurate. That the rabbis actually, for the most part, at this point in time, feel very rooted in Babylonia. And they really feel like the Torah has come with them to Babylonia, which is not to say that they aren't anticipating at some point a return. There is a wonderful dissertation about what the rabbis think Passover is actually going to look like in the future, written by Dr. Rachel Scheinerman. So this is a really important question of how much do they see themselves as rooted in Babylonia. But I actually think they're seeing themselves as rooted in Babylonia. And I think that they are seeing themselves, or hoping themselves to be the righteous. And I think that as I think it was Michael who put in the chat, some of the fruit that they're growing are in fact students. Now, I'll also note just one other thing here. When I was talking about the rabbis, I was talking about the editors who put the Talmud together. But many of the rabbis that they quote are actually in the land of Israel. Liani is a Roman name. So I did not, my apologies, I did not look up exactly where Rabbi Chia bar Liani is. But many of them are in the land of Israel. And those two communities have deep connections to each other. So I think both communities feel like they are rooted. Both communities have a sense that they are distant from maybe a time in history when there was a temple. That's for sure. But I don't know whether they feel differently rooted in that way. Dr. Scheinerman, this is literally your area of expertise.
Are we talking about Passover? I'm sorry, I was responding to a chat.
Just in general, the idea of how much are they anticipating a return to Jerusalem?
Oh, that is a good question. I did make a strong case in my dissertation against some previous arguments that the early generations of rabbis, the Tannaitic rabbis, that they were strongly anticipating a return of the temple. That the temple had been destroyed once and come back before, and that their way of writing about Passover suggested to me that they fully expected that it would come back, possibly Bakarov B'Yameinu, like close and soon and in our day. So that was my case. One of the tricky things about Talmud is that we are looking at so many generations that are interspersed. Lahavdil, in a different realm, in astronomy, when people look at the night sky and look at all those stars, you are not seeing all those stars at the same time, right? Because they're different distances. And so the light has come to us from different points in history. So everything you're seeing in the night sky is in the past, but some of it is in the far more distant past, depending on how far away those stars are, right? Which is like really trippy to think about. Because when I look at my kids, I'm looking at them in the present, right? All three of them in their age there are now. But when I'm looking at the sky, everything is in the past, but it's all different past. And it is not immediate obvious to me which stars I'm looking at are, I don't even know, 8 years ago, 100 years ago, 1,000,000 years ago, right? It's all quite different. And that's kind of what it's like reading the Talmud too, right? And so it takes a lot of time, I think. And I feel like I'm still figuring this out when you're reading the Talmud to know which community of rabbis you're speaking to. And they are having very different experiences depending on whether they are in the generations that followed the destruction of the temple and still living in the land of Israel and under Roman rule, or they're living 5 centuries later in Babylonia, and it's a whole different ballgame for them. So did that answer the question? Dr. Reynolds, was that what
Oh,
you're
yeah,
looking?
you absolutely. Thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah. We probably have time for maybe one more question or comment before we wrap up. Do you see something in the chat, or does someone want to raise their hand?
Let me take a look. I'm chatting and not reading. Right. Okay. So Paul Schlichtman says that maybe this is how we are in North America too. A lot of us feel at home here. Maybe this is how the rabbis felt. Laura says, why spend so much time on temple rules and observances if they didn't think there would be another temple? Okay. So Laura, this is what I was saying. I thought that a lot of them did think. I think you'll find people today who still think that. But that's a good question. If you don't think that, if you think that they accepted that there wasn't going to be another temple, at least not imminently, why would you spend so much time on it? That is a very good question. And there are a lot of different answers, including the rabbinic notion that studying the laws of worship and service to God is equivalent to performing those acts of service, right? That is one answer among many that we find in the text. Leah, I see you have your hand up, and you should be able to speak now.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for a wonderfully fascinating session. I'm not an arborist either by any means, but it just occurred to me that whether these trees are permanent, whether you dig them up or whether they regrow, that's the difference between our where we all live. We have different ideas about the permanence of our current residence. However, both trees produce some form of something that you can take away. The date palm produces dates. You can eat the dates all over the world. The cedar, you can take that cedar wood and you can ship it to any place in the world. So the fruits of our studies, the fruits of our tradition, of our actions, they are independent of their place of origin.
I think that's a beautiful idea. I really do. And I think, what that seems like a beautiful place for us to end, thinking about where the fruits of our Torah will end up. all of us in the many places that we have joined from today, from Toronto to Saudi Arabia, right? Thinking about where do our matters of Torah end up, whether that is our good deeds, whether that is our insights, whether that is our contributions to the world, whether that is our children. Thinking about all the ways that what we are doing can be shared and is shared across the globe. So this is the last time I'm going to see you before Rosh Hashanah. So let me wish you all a wonderful new year, a happy 5785. May it be better than this year. And I hope this year was great. So that's really saying something. All right. Have a great morning, everyone.
Okay. Thank you, Dr. Onus. Thank you, all of you, for the insightful thoughts, comments, and questions. We will see you next week in this space. Since Dr. Onus mentioned this whole number of holidays that are coming up in October this year, I should mention a lot of them fall on Thursday. So watch your email, and we'll also make announcements about when we will meet and when we will not meet in deference to all these Jewish holidays that we are about to celebrate. But in the meantime, I'll just wish everyone Shabbat Shalom, because that's the next one coming. All right. Bye, everyone.